The Peterson family had moved to Willow Creek with high hopes of finding peace. The neighborhood was lined with tidy hedges, trimmed lawns, and pastel-colored houses, all wrapped up in what looked like suburban perfection. But beneath the charm was a rule-bound monster, the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. From the very beginning, it seemed the HOA made it their mission to torment the Petersons. Their fence was 2 inches too high. Their shed was the wrong shade of brown. Their dog barked too enthusiastically, yet what really burned into the family's nerves was how the HOA patrol handled complaints. One evening, Sarah Peterson, just 12 years old, sat in the backyard sketching in her notebook. The late summer breeze was warm, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. She heard a creak. Looking up, she froze. A man in a neon HOA vest was halfway up their wooden fence, his boot pressing hard against the boards as he climbed. He held a clipboard, muttering something about violations. "Grandpa!" she screamed, her pencil dropping to the dirt. Grandpa. Jim came storming out of the house faster than anyone thought his 70 years would allow. His voice thundered, "Hey! What do you think you're doing on my property?" The patrolman jumped down, fumbling with his clipboard. "Routine inspection, sir, just routine." "Routine?" Grandpa's face turned red. "Since when does routine mean climbing a family's fence without knocking on their door?" The man stammered, tried to argue, then retreated quickly down the street. It was the 3rd time in as many weeks that the HOA patrol had tried something like this. That night, as the crickets chirped outside and the Petersons sat at the dinner table, frustration filled the air thicker than the smell of pot roast. Sarah's father muttered, "This is harassment. They don't respect boundaries anymore." Grandpa Jim pushed his chair back and stared out the window at the fence, his jaw set like stone. He wasn't just angry. He was resolved. This wasn't just about a fence. This was about dignity. And that night, as everyone else slept, Grandpa stayed awake with a notebook and an idea that would soon shock the entire neighborhood, literally. The house was dark except for the warm glow of the kitchen light. Everyone else had gone to bed, but Grandpa Jim sat hunched over the table with a pencil and a blank notebook. His glasses slid down his nose as he sketched, erasing and redrawing lines. To anyone else, it looked like doodles. To him, it was the blueprint of justice. He muttered, under his breath, "They think they can hop my fence like it's a public park? Not on my watch. I didn't spend 40 years wiring systems, only to let some clipboard warrior disrespect my family." The truth was, Jim hadn't retired easily. He was a proud electrician, the kind of man who believed in building things to last. Since his wife passed, he poured his energy into protecting the Peterson home. The HOA had poked the wrong bear. Around midnight, Sarah crept down the stairs. She found him scribbling on the pad, surrounded by old coils of wire and his dented, red toolbox. "Grandpa, are you building something?" she asked softly. He looked up, his eyes glinting with the kind of mischief Sarah usually saw in her classmates, not in her 70-year-old grandfather. "Just a little deterrent. Nothing dangerous, but enough to make them think twice before laying a hand on our fence again." Sarah sat beside him, peeking at the paper. "It looks like electricity?" Jim chuckled, tapping his pencil on the drawing. "Exactly. A low-voltage current. Won't harm anyone, but it'll give them a memory they won't soon forget. I call it respect through persuasion." The next morning, while most of Willow Creek headed to work, Grandpa carried his toolbox outside. The old boards of the fence creaked as he inspected them, his mind already assembling circuits in his head. Neighbors peered from their curtains, whispering. Mrs. Jacobs across the street muttered, "What on earth is he up to now?" But some of the younger residents, who'd also been bullied by the HOA, offered quiet nods of approval. One even whispered to Sarah, "Tell your grandpa we're rooting for him." By afternoon, wires were already being threaded along the gateposts. Grandpa worked with a steady hand, his face lit up with determination. To him, this wasn't rebellion. It was teaching the HOA the language they understood. And as the sun set, Grandpa wiped the sweat from his brow, looked at his humming creation, and whispered, "Now, let's see who's brave enough to try me." By the third day of Grandpa's project, the neighborhood was buzzing, both figuratively and, thanks to the faint hum of wires, literally. Every time Jim stepped outside with his toolbox, curtains twitched and blinds snapped shut. Mrs. Caldwell, the notorious HOA president, was the first to sound the alarm. She marched up and down the street with her pearl necklace swinging and her clipboard clutched like a weapon. "This is unacceptable. He's endangering the community," she told anyone who would listen. But her voice carried the shrill panic of someone who knew her authority was slipping. Meanwhile, not everyone was against Grandpa. The Millers, who lived 2 houses down, stopped Sarah on her way back from school. "Your grandpa's got guts," Mr. Miller whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Last month they fined us for having a garden gnome. A gnome! If this makes them think twice, well, we're not complaining." Inside the Peterson home, the family wasn't so sure. Sarah's father, Michael, paced the living room. "Dad, you can't just electrify the fence. What if this escalates? What if someone gets hurt?" Jim leaned back in his recliner, arms crossed. "It's a low-voltage deterrent. Safer than a toaster. The only thing it'll hurt is their pride." "But pride isn't what they'll sue over," Michael argued. "They'll drag us into court." Sarah, sitting cross-legged on the rug, piped up. "Maybe they need to be dragged into the real world. They think they can break rules because they make the rules. Grandpa's just showing them what boundaries mean." Her words silenced the room. For a moment, even Michael looked thoughtful. Jim gave his granddaughter a proud smile. That evening, neighbors gathered in hushed groups on the sidewalk. Children whispered about the electric fence, turning it into a legend before their parents pulled them inside. The HOA patrol slowed, their usual rounds, circling the Petersons' property like nervous dogs sniffing at a new boundary. Grandpa sat calmly on the porch with his old pipe, rocking gently in his chair. He watched the street like a sentry, his eyes sharp. To him, the porch wasn't just a place to sit anymore. It was his command post. And as night fell, a patrolman finally worked up the nerve to test the Peterson fence, unaware that Grandpa was waiting in the shadows with his coffee mug in hand. It was just after sunrise when the first real test came. The neighborhood was still quiet, dew glistening on grass, birds chattering softly in the oak trees. Grandpa Jim sat on the porch in his rocking chair, a steaming mug of black coffee in hand, the wires on the fence faintly humming behind him like a hidden orchestra warming up. Down the street, the HOA patrol appeared. Clipboard man himself, the same one who had tried to scale the fence before. His vest was too bright for the soft morning light, and his walk had that mix of arrogance and nervousness only a petty enforcer could carry. Jim didn't move. He just watched. The patrolman circled the property, scribbling on his clipboard. He muttered about unapproved landscaping and fence repairs overdue. Finally, he stopped at the gate, the one Grandpa had wired most carefully. He tapped his pen against the wood as if daring it to challenge him. Then, with a self-satisfied sniff, he began to climb. Zzzt. The crackle of electricity was sharp, but brief, a clean snap in the air. The man yelped, his hand jerking back as though bitten by a snake. He stumbled, lost his footing, and fell flat onto the damp grass with a thud. His clipboard went flying, scattering papers like startled birds. From the porch, Grandpa didn't flinch. He took a long, slow sip of coffee and muttered, "Morning, sunshine." The patrolman scrambled up, his face a mix of rage and embarrassment. He rubbed his tingling hand, glaring at the house as though the siding itself had mocked him. But when his eyes flicked to Grandpa, sitting calm as ever, that glare faltered. For the first time, the man looked uncertain. Sarah peeked through the curtains, barely containing her giggles. "Grandpa, did you see his face?" she whispered when she rushed outside. "I saw enough," Grandpa replied with a smirk. "And so did he. That's one lesson learned." But as the patrolman limped away, he didn't just retreat in silence. He stomped straight toward Mrs. Caldwell's house. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, knowing full well this wasn't the end. Mrs. Caldwell would not take humiliation lightly, and her retaliation was already brewing. The sun was barely overhead when the Petersons noticed unusual movement on the street. Cars with tinted windows rolled up quietly and parked in front of Mrs. Caldwell's house. Men and women in neatly pressed clothes stepped out, holding thick binders and polished briefcases. They weren't just HOA patrol members. This was the full board. From his perch on the porch, Grandpa Jim narrowed his eyes. "Board meeting," he muttered, puffing on his pipe. "But not in their clubhouse, right here in the battlefield." Inside, Sarah's mother peeked through the blinds. "Jim, this is serious. They brought their lawyers." "Good," Jim said. "Lawyers are easier to handle than cowards with clipboards." Minutes later, Mrs. Caldwell herself appeared, marching down the sidewalk with the fury of a queen who had been publicly mocked. Her pearls gleamed, her heels clicked, and her mouth was already moving before she reached the fence. "James Peterson," she shouted, her voice cutting through the street like a siren. "You are in direct violation of Section 14, subsection C of the Willow Creek HOA Charter. Hazardous structures and unapproved electrical installations. You are endangering the lives of residents." Grandpa didn't rise from his chair. He just tilted his head and squinted at her. "Endangering lives? Lady, it's less voltage than a doorknob in winter. Only thing hurt was that fella's pride." Gasps rippled through the cluster of neighbors who had gathered. Some tried to hide smiles, others covered their mouths in shock. Mrs. Caldwell turned, red, her voice shaking as she bellowed, "This is an outrage! You will dismantle that contraption immediately or face fines, lawsuits, and possible criminal charges." Sarah tugged on her dad's sleeve. "Are they really going to arrest Grandpa?" Michael frowned, torn between frustration and fear. "They might try." But Grandpa leaned forward, setting his mug down with deliberate calm. "Mrs. Caldwell, you've sent your patrol onto my land 3 times without permission. They've harassed my granddaughter. They've climbed my fence like it's a public jungle gym. I warned them once, twice. Now I've given them a reminder that boundaries mean something," the crowd murmured, nodding quietly. For the first time, the HOA's iron grip seemed to loosen as neighbors realized they weren't alone. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes darted nervously to the gathering. Losing face was worse to her than losing money. Her lips pressed thin and she hissed, "Fine. If you won't listen, then you'll regret this." She spun on her heel, heels clacking like a gavel. Grandpa knew what was coming. The HOA president wouldn't stop at words. And the next move she made would turn the whole neighborhood into a war zone. By the end of the week, Willow Creek felt less like a neighborhood and more like a battlefield. Lines were drawn, not with fences, but with whispers, looks, and hastily whispered alliances. On one side, Mrs. Caldwell rallied her loyalists. She sent out flyers stuffed in mailboxes, warning of a dangerous electrical hazard threatening children and pets. She knocked on doors in her heels, gathering signatures for what she called a safety petition. In reality, it was a declaration of war against Grandpa Jim. On the other side, quiet resistance was growing. The Millers, the Nguyens, and even old Mr. Harris down the block began speaking openly about their own grievances. Fines for flower pots, threats over mailbox paint, harassment for harmless backyard projects. For years, people had swallowed their frustration. Now, Grandpa's wired fence had become a symbol. Sarah noticed it first when she walked home from school. A neighbor she barely knew gave her a small smile and whispered, Tell your grandpa thank you. Another slipped a note into their mailbox. Stand strong. We're with you. But tension brewed inside the Peterson home. Michael was torn, pacing the kitchen at night. Dad, this is spiraling. It's not just about us anymore. The whole neighborhood's splitting apart. Grandpa calmly adjusted his tool belt, polishing a set of pliers. Sometimes, Michael, something has to split before it can heal. They've ruled by fear too long. Folks just needed someone to remind them fear works both ways. Sarah's mother wrung her hands. But what if Caldwell calls the police? What if they actually take you away? Jim leaned back, his eyes glinting. Then they'll see what a 70-year-old man in a rocking chair can do for justice. I'm not backing down. That night, the air in Willow Creek was thick with unease. Neighbors peeked from porches, whispering across driveways. Dogs barked more than usual. Even the crickets seemed quieter, as if the entire street was holding its breath. On the Peterson porch, Grandpa sat steady, pipe in hand, eyes never leaving the fence. To him, it wasn't just wood and wire anymore. It was a line in the sand. Hook. And as headlights appeared at the far end of the street, 3 cars pulling up slow and deliberate, Grandpa knew the HOA was making their final move. The night was heavy with silence as 3 black sedans rolled slowly down Willow Creek, their headlights slicing through the dark. Curtains lifted. Neighbors held their breath. Everyone knew this wasn't just another patrol. It was the HOA board making its final stand. Grandpa Jim sat on the porch as if he'd been waiting all evening. His rocking chair creaked softly, the glow of his pipe flickering in the dark. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, heart pounding. Michael hovered, nearby, ready to step in, though he wasn't sure how. The cars stopped in front of the Petersons' gate. Out stepped Mrs. Caldwell in a tailored suit, flanked by 2 board members carrying binders and a man in a cheap suit who looked far too eager to be called legal counsel. Behind them, the same patrolman who'd been shocked days earlier, hung back, nursing his pride like a fresh bruise. James Peterson, Mrs. Caldwell announced, her voice echoing across the quiet street. This ends tonight. You are hereby ordered to dismantle this hazardous installation immediately. If you refuse, we have no choice but to pursue legal and municipal enforcement. We are prepared to escalate this matter. Grandpa didn't rise. He set his pipe down, took a long sip of coffee, and finally stood. His back was straight, his voice steady. Hazardous? No. What's hazardous is a group of self-appointed enforcers climbing fences, trespassing on family land, and scaring children. You broke trust first. My fence only reminded you of it. Neighbors began to drift out onto porches, watching. Crowd grew, silent, tense, but present. Mrs. Caldwell faltered for just a moment under their stares. She snapped back quickly. You think this little stunt makes you a hero? You've endangered this entire neighborhood. No, a voice called from the crowd. Mr. Miller stepped forward. He's protecting it, something you stopped doing years ago. Another neighbor joined in, then another. Soon, murmurs turned into a chorus. He's right. We've had enough. The HOA's gone too far. The board members shifted uneasily, realizing the tide was turning. Even the lawyer cleared his throat and muttered something about reconsidering litigation. Mrs. Caldwell's face burned crimson. She sputtered threats, waved her clipboard like a sword, but the crowd no longer looked afraid. They were standing with Grandpa. Jim leaned against the porch railing, his eyes fixed on Caldwell. You wanted power, Caldwell. You had it. But respect, that's something you can't find your way into. Tonight, you lost it. The board retreated under the weight of dozens of watching eyes. Caldwell barked one last threat, but it sounded hollow, her heels clacking furiously as she stormed away. Grandpa sank back into his chair, the hum of the fence, a quiet victory song. Sarah ran onto the porch, hugging him tight. "You did it, Grandpa," she whispered. He chuckled, ruffling her hair. "No, kiddo. We did it. Sometimes all it takes is one spark to light up the dark." As the HOA cars disappeared into the night, Willow Creek felt different, lighter, freer. The neighbors didn't just see a fence anymore. They saw a man who'd stood his ground, and in doing so gave them the courage to stand too. And from that night on, the Peterson porch wasn't just a place to rock in peace. It was the symbol of a neighborhood that finally learned to push back.